when you think about the word trauma or mental health, this has been a long, long time, but mental health and trauma kind of coincide together. And there's always been a really big shroud over mental health and mental health services. And I think that it's always been taboo to talk about mental health. And it's always been, hush, we're not going to talk about whatever happened. I think that in light of what's happened with COVID, there has been a huge shift. And I'm not seeing a shift. I'm not saying there's a change yet, but I feel like there's this huge shift that people are becoming much more aware of mental health.
Do you want to wake up feeling like you're stepping into who you're meant to be, into the best possible version of you? What if I told you that the key to your best life, health, and happiness are all around you? You just have to find what works for you. I'm Hope Pedraza, and I believe that there isn't just one way to live a healthy and meaningful life, and that all you need is a little inspiration to make changes that last from the inside out. Each week, I'll be sharing tangible tips and inspirational interviews to help you on your journey. These are the steps to take to improve your life and live with purpose. This is Hopeful and Wholesome. Hey y'all, welcome back to Hopeful and Wholesome. Today I have on the show my friend Tami Lysher. And now Tami is a movement educator for more than 30 years, focusing on yoga and Pilates. And she takes a little bit of a different approach because she takes this holistic approach, integrates movement with breathing, the nervous system, and then brain-body connection. And we are talking all about trauma-informed movement today. She's created these trauma-informed movement programs for adults and kids, focusing on how trauma affects the body and how trauma affects movement and how that affects everything going on in the body. Really is a really fascinating conversation. I know we've talked a lot about, trauma and the nervous system before, but really when we're talking about movement, it's really a whole different conversation. So this conversation, even if you're not a movement practitioner, but it is especially relevant for those who teach movement, whether it's yoga, Pilates, personal trainer, but it really is relevant to everybody as we're talking about how trauma affects movement and affects every part of the body and really just your overall health. So I'm excited to bring y'all this interview with Tami. So let's jump in. All right, y'all, let's jump in. I'm here with Tami and we are talking about trauma today. And we're talking it in a little bit different way because I know we've talked a little bit about like the nervous system and trauma and your health a little bit on the podcast, but Tami is really an expert in trauma-informed movement, and we're going to kind of shift the conversation that direction. So I'm really excited for y'all to hear all of the insight that Tami has around the subject. So thanks so much for joining me today, Tami.
Thank you for having me, Hope.
Yes. So let's and again, I know we've talked a little about trauma on the podcast before, but Tami, why don't you give people just kind of a brief, review, if you will, of like what exactly trauma is?
I like to use the word trauma is a disconnect that we experience due to what happened to us or what didn't happen to us. So that could be what didn't happen to you. So if you didn't get your needs met as a child, an infant, a toddler, or even a teenager, that can create the disconnect in the earlier years in our development. Once the disconnect sets in, it shatters the overall sense of safety. So our sense of, like the nervous system and how we respond in the nervous system. And going back to that whole like fight, flight, or freeze. And I did listen to a couple of the other podcasts, so I'm not going to go into it deep with that. Yeah. But it really does, it sets the tone for us in a lot of different ways.
Yeah. Yeah. So, there's so much talk about trauma. And, and all of y'all who are listening, if you caught me in Tami's masterclass, we talked a little bit about this, that there's kind of this stigma around trauma. So can you kind of speak to that? And I guess, what people's kind of misconceptions or what that stigma is around trauma.
Do you want me to speak to it from like general or more specific to movement?
Let's do both. Let's do both because we are going to shift the conversation to movement. So let's do both.
So initially, like when you think about the word trauma or mental health, there has always been, and this has been a long, long time, but mental health and trauma kind of coincide together. And, there's always been a really big shroud over mental health and mental health services. And I think that it's always been taboo to talk about mental health. And it's always been, hush, we're not going to talk about whatever happened. And I think that in light of what's happened with COVID, there has been a huge shift. And I'm not seeing a shift. I'm not saying there's a change yet, but I feel like there's this huge shift that people are becoming much more aware of mental health. And I just recently read a study, and it's really kind of scary, but they said there's been a huge increase in teen suicide, and like a lot, like for teens, because of the isolation. Because when you think about being a teenager, what's your whole life revolve around but your friends?
Totally.
And there's been the stigma behind that. And I just think that people don't want it. It's almost like it's become a secret. Like, don't talk about your trauma, but you can't deny that what happens to you or did happen to you still has a bearing on us as adults today.
Yep.
And then in the movement industry, and I can tell you from talking with other movement, and when I say movement, I'm talking Pilates and yoga and even like personal trainers, that when talking about trauma, people will say that's taking it outside the scope of my practice. But when you learn to work within your scope of practice, it's not. Because quite frankly, we learn all about anatomy, we learn about fascia, we learn about gut health, and we learn about all these other things. And it only seems logical that we would look at or talk about trauma-informed movement. Mm-hmm. So, and that looks different for everybody because we're all individuals. And so even though we don't want to think about bringing our own trauma to the table as educators, and I say educators, but we all are coming with our own traumas. Mm-hmm. And so we're walking into a studio or even trauma-informed schools or trauma-informed businesses that, you collectively, we're all coming with some kind of trauma, mental health, whatever you want to call it. And I just think it's part of my messaging is I really feel like the education and awareness is so critical for this topic. And I probably have gotten a little more outspoken about it because I just feel really passionate about it. And people will sugarcoat it. Oh, we're people pleasing, or we're lack of boundaries, or we're perfectionist. Well, all of those things, the underlying root cause of those things is usually trauma of some kind.
Right. Yeah. So how do you relate that to movement? When you're talking about trauma-informed movement, how does that relate?
So it's kind of twofold, where we have clients that are coming into our studios, and and there's not going to be an end-all fix for anybody, but it's creating what I call looking through a trauma-informed lens. And so having a basic understanding of what trauma is, understanding how it impacts our nervous system, and we're not going to unpack that right now, understanding how it impacts our nervous system, and how when people have gone through trauma, and I like to relate this, and I'm going to talk specifically about Pilates because we want them to stay within the scope of Pilates, and then relating it back to Pilates principles. If somebody is experiencing something like, for example, breathing, most people who've gone through trauma only use the upper portion of their lungs. So breathing deep sometimes can be hard for people, but it's looking at individuals as a whole and not necessarily teaching. And people use teaching to the body in front of me, but if you're teaching a private, for example, maybe you have to move a little bit beyond the scope of Pilates practice or giving choices. So if this doesn't feel right to your body, then try this. And even if you're teaching, just even say a mat class, for example, we start off with the foundational moves, but offering choices for people, because so oftentimes when people have gone through trauma, they've not necessarily had that autonomy or the choices to make for themselves. If a woman has gone through domestic violence, for example, she's had a lot of those things taken away from her. And sometimes the choices can be scary for people. So it's easing them into it. I've had people say to me, well, you just tell me what to do. Mm-hmm. And as a trauma-informed movement person, and I do a lot of work individually in my studio with trauma-informed people or trauma people or clients, I should say. And when I meet them, I don't say, hi, I'm Tami, I'm trauma-informed. I let it unfold. And usually you can see it in their bodies. You can see it in their movement or lack of movement. You can see it in their, just their demeanor, in their face. There also can be fear around it as well. So trying something new. And we all have, I'm just going to use, trying something new and not stepping outside it. So this is what I practice. And getting them to go to the next level and take it outside of their comfort zone sometimes can be really challenging and hard for people as well.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and when we're talking about, which I know this is the conversation, it could go another direction if we start talking about, but we're talking about like healing from trauma and stuff and all the ways that you can heal from trauma. We all know that movement is good for the body and that movement can be healing for trauma. So how can people, for those who are, have experienced trauma and, they can be triggered by certain things when they're in a movement session, like what are some ways movement can help heal the body from trauma?
It releases. Actually, I just want to say, I just read an article that was put out by PMA this afternoon, like literally this afternoon. And it was talking about how and they didn't use it, they used the word mental health is what the words they used for this article. And I only got a portion of it, but for what I did look at it, but it's, let's just say, if you feel stuck, like even doing like back bending or anything, like if you're feeling stuck, like in your chest or your throat area, like even doing like thigh stretch on the reformer, and pulling the straps back and then opening up can sometimes be a release. The other thing too is like a lot of times if women especially carry it in their neck and their shoulders, even pulling the straps back and turning, side to side, but giving them a little bit more autonomy. If it doesn't feel good going back and forth, maybe you drop your chin down toward your chest and you lift that chin and chest all the way up. So still, like I said, staying within those parameters. Sometimes we have to, and I say we, I'm just speaking here from experience, you might get resistance from women if they're on their backs or on the reformer. And really, in reality, there's no I don't like to ask questions. That's not my job. And I always like to say that my job is to observe and my job is to begin to allow some kind of movement. So again, the movement parts of it. But for somebody who has been, and it's not a nice subject to talk about, but we're going to, if they've been sexually abused and they're on the reformer and they're on their back. So that's number one, that's very submissive for them. But number two, to put their legs in the straps and do leg circles can be really intimidating for some people. And I actually have had this happen in my studio. And she didn't have to tell me because I had worked with sexually abused women before in another setting. So I knew, I could just tell by the body language. And I know that I'm not everybody when it comes to this kind of stuff. So I'm just giving you what I experienced as well. So starting off with okay, it doesn't feel good to do leg circles. So maybe you just open your legs just a little and then bring them back together again. Or they start with small leg circles and then gradually beginning to increase the size of their circles to where they feel comfortable. And then even taking it into stag on the reformer, you got one leg out, one leg done in, and there's no cookie cutter recipe for trauma informed movement. I think people have to be willing to dig deep. Yeah. And sometimes it allows, we have to look at our clients' healing, but sometimes it also can be a blessing in disguise and it becomes a part of our healing.
Yeah.
And I think that really integrating open-ended, giving them choices and autonomy, but also asking open-ended questions, beginning to get them to identify where they're feeling the movement. I really don't cue anatomy much anymore unless I have I have a lady who's a nurse and she wants to know. So I'll say, okay, did you feel it in whatever? Right. And she's probably my only client that I do that with because I want people to begin to connect interoceptum or inward, because a lot of time what happens when people have gone through trauma is they numb themselves and they don't feel and they don't have a lot of emotions. And sometimes their vocabulary is even very limited on their emotions. Yeah. And, you might hear things. I'll give you an example because it's just kind of, so I have a client and I tried doing some nervous system work with her and she did not like it. That's all I'm going to say. And her response to me is, how do you feel? Okay. How do you feel? I'm okay. How do you feel? I'm okay. Well, so then one day I was trying to I said to her, okay, you have 3 okays. And then I decided to put a label on her okays and she started laughing and I've been working with her and she's a breast cancer survivor, is how she started coming to me first. So she had a lot of trauma with her breast. But long story short, she now is able to label more of her emotions. Like today, I had her in a session today and I said, how are you? And she said, I'm feeling wonderful today. And it's like, that's just one example. But I think that overall, I really think that the industry is doing an injustice for not, when we go to Pilates trainings, whether you're in a mat training or whether you're in reformer training, and beginning to talk about some of these, what I'm going to call the human side of Pilates. Does that make sense when I say that?
Totally. Absolutely.
So, and I would hope someday that we could, and I don't care if it's me or somebody else. I just want it to become more of a normalized conversation.
Right.
And what is normal?
Right. Yeah.
What's
you're right. You're right.
What's normal? Because it's like going to, and it affects us also differently. How it affects us emotionally. And it's like, we had our conversation around wellness, but when you talk about wellness, you can't help but think about the whole body and how it affects us. So, and I know, and it's how it affects us emotionally, how it affects us mentally, and what happens to our bodies when it happens to us.
Well, I think that's the thing. I think that, I think I talked about this last week on Instagram, maybe it was this week, that, trauma isn't in your mind, it's in your body.
No,
that's where we hold it. And so I think I agree with you that movement, and any movement practitioner, doesn't have to be Pilates, any movement practitioner. I think we are doing a disservice to people when we're excluding, that part out of the conversation. We're talking about movement because I think it's just like anything else. And this isn't to like go on a tangent about like rigid structures of teacher trainings. But for me, that's one of the reasons why in my studio, we teach multi-level classes. We don't level out our classes. We teach contemporary because I feel like, the rigidity of a classical class is not for everybody. I think that it has its place. And I know some people are very, very
I know,
hardcore.
I know.
But you know what I'm saying? It's that rigidity. And I like that you were saying, like giving people autonomy, like giving people choices. And I think that's what it's about. I think it's just like anything though. Like I talk about diets all the time the same way. Like there's no one size fits all diet, right? There's no one size fits all way to deal with someone who has dealt with trauma in terms of movement or healing or anything.
Correct. And I would say too, that I definitely teach contemporary and I do only privates, whether they're in the studio or, I have a couple small Zoom classes, but they've been ladies that I've had for a really long time. But I think that when we think about trauma informed, it's taking off or putting on, like taking off your glasses and really looking and observing with your eyes as well as with the body language. And the part of what I had a conversation earlier, and we talked about safety. And it's not just safety in the aspect of coming into the studio and people feeling safe and what we think is safe. It's somebody feeling safe within their body. And are they safe? Do they feel safe emotionally, mentally? The whole, going spiritually, emotionally, physically, the whole 9 yards. And what's going on with them. And it's not something necessarily that we can always control.
Yeah. So, for sure. Well, and it's like you were saying too, people deal with it differently, but then you have people, you're talking about people who, they have limited vocabulary and you can just read in their posture and their energy, right? It's like, it's that part of the trauma response that's disassociation, right? They've like disassociated from life, really.
Right.
So it's like, how do you reach those people? Obviously, movement is going to be beneficial to them, but you have to know how to reach those people.
Yeah. And the other thing I think is really important to mention, and we're not going to go too deep into it, but trauma, the earlier it happens in a life or our lives or whatever, the memory can be really like it can be skewed, but it really affects the memory. And so consequently, like something that would have happened, let's just say to a child when they were, 5 or 6, but they have a sibling that's a few years older. And so the interpretation of the 5-year-old, now that's their rendition of that story and it's their memory. But in reality, when the older sibling says, well, that's not really how it happened. But yet we have to think about even from the processing pieces of it, because sometimes people can be really emotional. And when you start to release trauma, or not us, but the clients, sometimes they just automatically start crying. And I read a post, I don't remember what group it was in, for Instagram. The other thing was, so this post was about a lady that came to class and all she did was want to talk.
Mm-hmm.
And they wanted to put all these parameters around it. But I always say, and I usually look at, like, if you've got an outward behavior, there's always something that drives the behavior down below. So I wonder what happened to her. Like, for her to come to class and have to be, and there's a lot of different, there's ways that we could, I don't know. I mean, you have to be creative, but she needed to be at Pilates just like anybody else did. But I realized that when you have talkers in class, it's not always, because it takes the focus away from their body, and it's like external. So, because if they're not used to focusing on the body awareness and they're focusing on everything else around them, that's going to be a big piece of it.
Absolutely. That's such a good point. Yeah. No,
that's why going back to like the Pilates cues, the Pilates principles and body awareness and concentration. If you've got somebody who is dealing with whatever it is and we want them to concentrate and connect, sometimes they might have to come for a few sessions before they can actually begin to make that connection because of the disconnection or disassociation.
Yeah.
So, and it's just, I think that it's really, and I talked about this when I first started talking about trauma-informed movement, and I'm just going to briefly say something. When trauma happens to us as children, it's in our body, it's in our cells, and we can't change the way we are. But now come fast forward, and we've got some of these behaviors that are coming out in different ways. Maybe it's people pleasing or lack of boundary setting or perfectionism. And all three of those, the underlying current with it is some kind of trauma that forces this. Right. And I think that when we stop sugarcoating it and we start talking about it and think about, we all have those little, some people compartmentalize and they don't talk about their trauma, but as years go on, it's going to start bubbling to the top.
Right. So
it's awareness. Yeah. So the other thing that you were asking is, I would say movement for sure, but also giving them choices, like I said before, but like even let's just say mermaid and they're on the reformer and having them like, does it feel better if you take your arm over? Or what happens if you take it back a little bit as you press out? Mm-hmm. Or what happens if you start it out to the side and then you bring it? I try to be really creative and giving people choices with how they can move their body.
Yeah.
Sometimes it might be what feels right for them, and it might not even be in the Pilates repertoire, right? But it might be something close.
Yeah.
So there's still that we're still within the scope of it. So
yeah,
but
sure.
Yeah.
No, I love that, and I think it's important to, like you were talking about people who have like kind of disassociated from their body. I think too, like using the creative movement and stuff, you're just helping people come back into their body.
Correct.
And that's what it's all about, is helping people come back to their body.
Yes. Mm-hmm. It's almost like you're coming home internally.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep. That's exactly it. Yeah. So I'd love for you to share kind of a little bit of your story and just kind of how you got into this and how you got into this space.
Yep. I would love to. So first of all, I was one of those people that I was a perfectionist, and that's just how I always was. And I grew up in a home where there was no physical abuse. There was alcoholism, and my father was very active alcoholic. And as the years went on, trauma seemed to always be like a thread in my life, or major issues, a thread through my life. My ex-husband had some pretty serious mental health issues. Mm-hmm. And at about that same time, I owned a childcare center, and I worked with infants and toddlers. And so from there, I got degrees. And so I have multiple degrees, but they're all revolved back to, and so I ended up going and working with families that were affected by trauma. Mm. And so when I started like looking and seeing, so it was families that lived in poverty and they had young children. So like we're talking like birth to age 5. And I would see things within these children where they would have like significant speech delays. And that usually is a big piece of like when children have significant delays in speech, they're usually, and it shuts down a part of their brain, same part of the brain that shuts down when somebody has a stroke.
Yep.
So as time went on, and then seeing how it affected like how they walked, and then it transferred because I was teaching classes for their mothers, and then transferred to how they moved in their bodies, how they used food as comfort. I mean, like just like masking a lot of different things. And so then I started putting the pieces together, and I'm like, oh my Lord. And then I realized, and it just kind of wove from there. And I went on to teach a local, I shouldn't say, a University of Michigan Flint. And I taught trauma education in education courses. So I have a master's in education. And so I was teaching trauma to the teachers about what to look for in the children in the classrooms. But we never talked about the nervous system. We would talk about fight, flight, or freeze. And we would talk about those kind of things and strategies that they could use for children, basically like birth to age 8. And as the time went on, I was also heavily involved in yoga and fitness and things like that. And I'm talking a long time ago, Hope, when I'm going to say this. I always said somehow I was going to tie trauma and movement together. That was something that's been there on the back burner for me for probably 15 years.
That's awesome.
And so then COVID comes along, and I quit my full-time job to concentrate on the studio, and that's when the whole courses started. So I started first with writing one for children, and it was called Mindful Movement for Children for Jenna Safino. And I did a workshop, and it was for the movement educators. So like mothers like you at the beginning, like activities and things that you could do. And I used movement and literacy for their children. So I used books is what I essentially did. And then that would have been like in the summer of 2020. And then in fall of 2020, I started working with Chantel Lopez and Ann Bishop. And that's when I moved into like writing trauma-informed movement, and it's evolved to where it is today. And then I also have been, and actually it's still in process, I was asked by a breast surgeon, and I wrote a curriculum for what they wanted for post. So let me just make sure I'm saying this right. For post, like for women who have been, so now they're cleared from the doctors. And so it would be for post rehab, for a version of trauma-informed movement, but also emphasizing like lymphedema. And I also included journaling, and I included others like pieces of nutrition in there. So, and then I recently wrote another one, and it's a 28-day program, and it's called Demystifying the Trauma-Informed Approach. So people who have fear, like I'm not ready to jump into. So the course that I wrote first, it's a 10-week course, and it looks at trauma, and it looks at, health-related issues from trauma. And we'll talk about, anyways, there's health-related issues to the trauma and how it impacts us as individuals, but also how it impacts, our clients. And then looking at like cueing and language around it and the safety pieces of it, and even body language, and then bringing it all together. So in the version that I'm doing right now, I actually have students like bring what I'm going to call sample. Like I have students right now. She's a personal trainer as well as a Pilates instructor. And so she's brought examples of stuff that she has observed. She's like in week 4 of 10. And really, she's really done some pretty amazing things just from the stuff that we've talked about. And like asking her, and I'm asking her open-ended questions. So how she can begin to identify, because she's been teaching Pilates probably about maybe 4 or 5 years, but she's been practicing Pilates a lot longer. But it's been really enjoyable to see. So we do connect. So I do connect the Pilates back to it. Yeah. So it's like giving people ideas and suggestions and ideas. And you need to, and I know you know this because no two bodies are going to be alike, just like nobody's traumas are the same. And how we teach you're going to have to be willing to step outside the comfort zone and figure out what's going to work or what's going to unlock client A versus client B.
Yep.
And I really think that when we talk about trauma and trauma-informed movement, and I'm just going to say this, and we can individually be trauma-informed, but what about, and I'm just going to say this, what about studios? Our studios, because you can have lots of varying degrees of how people teach.
Right.
But, I'm just putting that out there. Businesses in school. I mean, because we talk like there's schools and there's businesses that are becoming trauma informed. And so it's like just thinking about, I'm thinking outside the box, you know,
Yeah, for sure.
for like teacher training and like things like that, or people within a studio setting.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I love that.
The journey, we ebb and we flow. And I've been teaching yoga and Pilates for yoga specifically, probably close to 25 or 30 years now. Pilates has been kind of like I practiced and then I started teaching. So I've only owned a studio for 4 years. And when I first started talking about this trauma-informed movement, I got a lot of pushback.
Yeah.
I got a lot of pushback. And people are now beginning to, they're listening. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah. I believe it. I think it's like you said at the beginning, like it's still, you know, people don't like to talk about uncomfortable things. So there's still a little bit of that, like, oh, like, let's not make people uncomfortable. But I also agree with you that there is a shift happening. It's a slow shift, but it is definitely happening because, you know, people are having conversations like this to normalize trauma. Because I mean, we've all faced trauma, you know, so.
Right. And I think it's when we talk about like, it's a hard conversation because somebody said to me, there's no trauma in Pilates. I said, no, there's no trauma in Pilates. There's trauma in the bodies that come to Pilates.
Exactly. That's exactly it.
And it's, you know, and it's peeling away the layers of the onion, so to speak, but not us, but the clients, but by giving them the autonomy, the choices, with movement where they can begin to integrate the movement within their body.
Right.
And hopefully, you know, the goal would be is to get them to take the movement home with them. And, you know, when they feel, you know, like just even doing like arm circles. Arm circles are really good. It's not only good for the lymphedema, but it's also good to help release some of the trauma. So I do like, I used like, and again, it's just giving them very like suggesting, okay, try the size of a golf ball and then try the size of a softball and then maybe try the size of a basketball and then maybe the size of a bigger ball and then maybe a hula hoop. But if it doesn't feel right, then keep your ball, keep it where you need to keep it.
Right.
So your own arms, because it can be fatiguing. So then stop and then reverse and then take them. So then downsize it from there. So the largest back down to the smallest. And it's just a matter of, you know, because that helps with like their shoulders. But if people, like even in the upper back, storing trauma, especially in the whole like lymph system, you know, so it.
Yep, for sure. Yeah. Well, your journey has just been so great. And I really see this just, you know, evolving. I see, you know, I've kind of seen how you've even just evolved over the past year or so. So I really see this evolving into so many places. And I think it's important. And I do have one question left that I'd like to ask you. But before I ask you that question, where can people find out more about you and about all these amazing courses that you have and where they can learn more about working with you?
Okay. They can find out more information right now. That probably the easiest way for them to get a hold of me is to direct message me, or I have some information on my website. I'm actually updating it so that it's Studio T Pilates, and the T is not for Tami. It was for teaser because I love the teaser. So studiotpilates.com. And I also be reached by email. It's studiotpil595@gmail.com.
Okay.
And I would really invite them to, you know, don't be afraid to have a conversation with me. I want people to, you know, I think that the course has to be fitting for them, not for me, but for them. And I keep my courses, the number of clients in the courses, I keep them smaller because I feel like this can be really intimidating work. And I keep it so people can begin to, because just like a client, they have to begin to trust me and understand that, you know, I'm coming to this with experience, but I've also taught it. And it's just it's kind of evolved, and it still continues to evolve because of like the movement pieces with it. And I think that in each session, when we do Zoom sessions, so I do weekly Zoom sessions with them, I record them, but I don't necessarily keep them in, it's called Rizuku, because I want it to be for each, like the calls especially.
Right.
Where people are learning. So my call with you would be different than what it would be with Susie Q, a year ago.
Right. Yeah, so, for sure. That's great. Yeah, I love that. And I'll put links to all that in the show notes. Everybody can go look at that. But the question I like to end with that I like to ask everybody is, what do you think is the most important thing you can do to live with purpose?
I think we all have had some kind of, you wouldn't be sitting here if you didn't have a dream at some point and making it come to reality. And I think we all come to whatever we're doing in life. We all have a talent. Sometimes we have to unbury it. We have to really look for what that purpose is. And I know that my purpose is to allow trauma. So instead of looking at it negatively, how can you grow from trauma? Yes, we had the experience, but it's like looking at, and sometimes it can be when you start looking at it and seeing everything that's out there, and how can you grow as a professional? But there is a quote that I like, and I want to read it. So this is from Harriet Tubman, and she says, "Every great dream begins with a dreamer. Always remember, you have the strength, the patience, and the passion to reach for the stars to change the world."
I love that. I love that. What poignant words to finish it off. I love that.
Yeah. It's just really something that finding what your passion is. Like and I would love at some point, to know there's a story behind your nutrition, and that's not for us to discuss today, but there obviously is, because you're so knowledgeable about that, just like, trauma, but it was been infused, especially in my professional life, for so long. And when I said years ago, somehow, and that was it, all I did was plant that seed. I literally hope probably 15 years ago. When I said that, and so then I just started seeking out stuff that was going to support me and propelling myself forward. And it just kind of happened.
Yeah. So you've spoken into existence and followed the steps.
I am more than open to having conversations with people. So just to get to know me as well. So, and I think that it's really important.
Yeah,
so
I love it. Well, thanks, Tami. And I'm going to put, of course, I'm going to put all the links there so y'all can reach out to Tami, ask questions, just become, more informed, because it's such an important conversation. So thank you so much, Tami, for spending time with us today and for sharing all of your insights. This is such a great conversation.
I thank you so much for having me too, Hope. I really have enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening to Hopeful and Wholesome, y'all. If you found value in this week's episode, please subscribe on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts, and leave a review to let me know what you thought. I love to know what you find useful in these episodes, so I know how I can provide the most value I can to my listeners. And if you have topics that you want to know more about, I'd love to hear those as well. So shoot me a message on Instagram, Facebook, or LinkedIn. It's @TheHopePedraza, or visit my website, hopefulandwholesome.com. Thanks, y'all.